Yeah, thank you very much. Just a brief introduction of EBA, the Expert Group for Aid Studies, where I work, which was where I was started this paper and this work. It's a newly set up committee under the Foreign Ministry with a task to look into, analyze and evaluate Swedish aid, so we can look into all kind of areas of Swedish aid. It's been there for a year, and it's a slow start, but it's coming. It's a small secretariat, and I work in that secretariat. We had a seminar a couple of months ago where we had the chronic poverty report presented, and also around this issue of what is Swedish aid doing when it comes to reducing poverty. So I'm going to talk about these 12 aid programs, 12 country programs. The starting point is that since its beginning some 50 years ago, Swedish aid has had poverty reduction as its overall objective in various forms. Last year the objective was changed again to create preconditions for better living, conditions for people living in poverty and under oppression. And this "and under oppression" was the addition given last year. So it has something to do with democracy support, then you can understand. Let's see if I can manage. Yeah, here. What we did was to start to ask Bob Walsh to do a paper for us. Bob Walsh is in Hanoi. He measured poverty focus at country level. On this picture you can see on the x-axis the cumulative share of extremely poor people living below $125 a day, PPP. You have the poorest countries, low-income countries, lower middle income and upper middle income countries, and the share of poor people living in DRC would be to the left, the poorest country to the left of this x-axis. Then the share of next country, adding up to all those living under $1.25 a day in these countries. And on the y-axis, the amount of aid given, and this is bilateral aid, the amount of aid given to these countries by various donors. And we asked him to look at 4 donors and also the average OECD DAC. You can see that the 45-degree line is there in the table as well. If you are above that, you're poverty focused, you could say. Sweden is the blue line. We start out quite good with aid to DRC and some other poor countries. Then we follow Denmark and the UK. But when it comes to lower middle income countries, we start losing out. And we make it all the way through. We beat the US and we beat the DAC average. But you see that we fall behind because we give quite a lot of aid to Eastern and Central Europe. Another way of measuring this would be the Suits index. That's a figure of that curve that you just saw. If you have a larger negative figure, you're more poverty focused. So you see that Sweden ends in the middle between Denmark and the UK, and on the other hand the US. Regardless if we talk about extreme poverty, $125 a day, moderate $2 a day, or non-monetary measures under 5 child mortality or children out of primary school. So Bob then looked at, this was Bob Walsh's paper. He looked at the country level. I was interested in also to look at what happens within countries. When we give aid to countries, do we do the right things? So why have I chosen these 12 countries then? Well, most of Swedish bilateral aid is given to 33 countries, 80% of it. And in 2007, there was a selection of these countries, a focusing program. 4 groups of countries were decided upon then. First, reform collaboration with countries in Central and Eastern Europe who aspire to become members of the EU. That's one category. Countries with specific democratic needs, that is authoritarian countries, was another group. Conflict-ridden and post-conflict countries, the third. And the fourth, countries for long-term development cooperation. There was also a fifth category for countries graduating out of aid, but these 4 were the main categories. My argument for choosing these 12 countries in the 4th category, long-term collaboration, is that it's more likely to find, it would be more feasible to build up a good poverty strategy in these countries. So this would be our best chance to find poverty-focused aid portfolios. And if we do not find it here, we would not expect it to find it elsewhere, probably. So I looked at documents and websites and scrutinized all interventions above 100,000 Swedish crowns, which is, what is it, 8,000 pounds, something, in these 12 countries programs for 2012 and 2013, almost 1,000 interventions. But some of them were the same over the 2 years. So I have not judged the effectiveness. I have not assessed how effective these programs are. I've placed them in a scheme where I've assessed them against what the Chronic Poverty Report held to be effective interventions to fighting poverty, and also looking at other research that supports that. So this scheme, or this evaluative norm, comes from the Chronic Poverty Report, basically. Now there is a table which I have certain problems with this, but there's a table here. Maybe you can't see everything, but these are the 12 countries on the left hand column. They have been ranked here according to the head count poverty incidence. I also added the poverty gap to see to what extent these figures are relevant, because they come from household surveys, which are undertaken every 5th years approximately. So these figures come from different years. We cannot take them too seriously then. These are indications. These are the last ones available, but you know that these figures are quite unstable, or it's not so exact. I also tried to add the trend over the 3 last household surveys, and on the right hand side there, the share of the Swedish ODA, which I have assessed to be effective at poverty reduction. So if we put this on a scatter plot, we can see that it varies a lot. You could, with goodwill, put in a line there and see some correlation, but basically, take a look at the x-axis where you see the incidence of poverty, which came from the previous table. Around 40–45% of poverty. You could get either 80% of the Swedish aid program to focused on poverty reduction. You could get 50% of it, or you could get 25% of it. So it varies quite a lot. And So the conclusion is that there must be other factors influencing the allocation of funds or the interventions here. What works in poverty reduction? Here's a timeline which it's a way of illustrating one thing, that poverty is dynamic. People are, you get interventions to tackle chronic poverty. When people move up above the poverty line, you need to have interventions to stop impoverishment, stop them falling down under it again. And then there is a need of support for sustaining poverty escapes. But making this as a timeline is not really correct, because these things are happening at the same time, all the time. So you need these interventions, these policies simultaneously. This is why poverty is dynamic. So I borrowed shamelessly from the Chronic Poverty Report. Here's my pirate copy. I made a pirate copy of this tripod just to show that I borrowed it. So the three legs here are tackling extreme poverty, stop impoverishment, and sustain poverty escapes. And underneath there are sub-policies or interventions that support each of these three legs. And there is also, at a more general level, a need for progressive social change, which we discussed intensively this morning, of course, and also the need to work to change social institutions. Governments are, of course, the ones responsible for doing this. They need to collaborate with civil society, with private sector, but there might also be a role for donors in this, and this is where my little paper comes in, I think. When I looked at these countries, you have them. There's a small error in this table, but you don't notice, and I think that is good. It's the order of countries. Tanzania should be further down. But I've marked with colors where interventions are done within this country program. So this is, you should try to get the overall image here rather than looking at the details. We come back to details later on. But the yellow countries, yellow colors here are something to do with education. Red has to do with social protection mechanisms. The blue, pro-poor growth or market development and management of productive resources. The lilac color, social political relations such as affirmative action or preventing conflict. The green are health-related interventions. So we can see that Sweden puts emphasis on pro-poor growth. The blue ones are fairly well represented, and also health, the green ones, but weaker on education and social protection. Here comes a few pluses. This means that if there is an intervention program or a combination of more interventions, up to 10 million Swedish crowns, and if it in the case that there is slightly more but still rather marginal interventions in the area, thematically marginal, I put 1+. There are asterisks on some of them that is because these are part of general budget support, which is given to 2 countries, Tanzania and Mozambique. 78 boxes here out of the double amount, I think, are filled with colors. 45 of these have 1+. Here I add 2 pluses, interventions between 10 to 30 million Swedish crowns with fairly broad thematic coverage, 19 boxes and then 14 boxes where the interventions above 30 million Swedish crowns and with broad thematic coverage. What we learn from this is that those interventions that are relevant for poverty reduction are neither very concentrated nor very comprehensive. It's Bolivia and Kenya and possibly Tanzania and Mozambique where you can talk about programs that sort of covers more of the categories here. In the other countries, it's more selective or more sparse. So let's move on to more detail here. When you see in the former picture, the leftmost third of that table is here, tackling extreme poverty. Here you possibly can see also the sub-themes: better quality basic education, social assistance, pro-poorest economic growth, affirmative action, and anti-discrimination. According to my assessment, the education is there in the Asian countries and also in the Latin American country, but in Africa it's absent, except Tanzania. Social assistance, here I've taken in humanitarian interventions in Mali and Ethiopia, also in Mozambique and Kenya. In Rwanda it was part of a market development program. So it's not really the programs of social assistance that we've talked about more widely. It's more of the humanitarian aid that comes into this. I still put it in. Pro-poor growth, interventions in most countries, you can see market development geared towards poor groups and job creation, agriculture. There's a different story on agriculture in Swedish aid that has been debated for years. The share of going to agriculture has decreased over the years and has remained quite low. But that's a different story. I haven't really gone into that detail when it comes to pro-poorest economic growth, whether it's agriculture or other sectors. But I could speak about that as well, but I don't do that here. Stopping impoverishment, not so many interventions here, as you see. Healthcare strongly, but the other parts of it, savings and insurance in financial development schemes or disaster risk management or preventing conflict. Of course, preventing conflict, you need a conflict to prevent, but so you should probably not do that everywhere. But disaster risk management would be relevant in much more countries than these. I move on. Sustained poverty escapes, similar pattern. The land policies and assets interventions to support people's access to assets and also mobility, fairly strong. But skills training and labor market links, it's totally absent in Swedish aid. Totally or almost absent. So it's very weak. Social protection. Well, we have this debate: should donors be involved at all? And that's debatable. But still, when especially African countries now introduce a number of programs in this area, there are certain things that could be done by donors, even if they should have a sort of hands-off approach. So much more could be expected in this area, I would say. And universal sexual and reproductive health and rights. That's a sort of profile area of Swedish aid. And still it's fairly weak when it comes to actual implementation. It's awareness building campaigns, yes, but not so much action in that area as you would expect. let's see. This was sort of what I did, and now I'm trying to dig a bit deeper into this problem by doing case studies, and I picked Burkina Faso and Tanzania to make more of a deeper study. I've not finished that totally yet, but I say a few words to see where, so that you can see where I've gone so far. If we take Burkina, it's a very dynamic poverty situation in that country. It's talk about a paradox, because there's a high level of economic growth, 5.8% per year from early 90s up till now, with high population growth. The real growth is something like 2.8%, but still quite impressive. And at the same time, the household surveys show a fairly stable poverty incidence over the years, even leading up to last 2009-10 household survey. So it stays at some 44%, despite this rapid growth. I've in other areas done some previous work on this, and I've noted that it's a rural phenomenon, 90% rural poverty still. It's clear that agriculture and what is related to agriculture is key here. Mining is coming strongly, but still agriculture. There's no clear geographical pattern to the poverty situation. You cannot really understand what drives poverty by looking at where it is, in which regions it is more prevalent. It's only when you start to look into how things are changing over time that you can try to find a pattern of more understanding what is driving and what is driving reduction in poverty. So if you do that, you can see that in the central eastern part of Burkina Faso, there has been a growth in cattle breeding, which is very profitable for many. In central north part of the country, there's been a growth in vegetable growing, and in more central west or central part, the expansion of cotton has been driving poverty reduction. These are quite long-term trends and actions taking place. There is also small but rising urban poverty. There is a strategy. There was a poverty reduction strategy shifted into growth and sustainable development strategy, SCAD 2010. That strategy is quite good, in line with the chronic poverty report when it comes to what is to be done to reduce poverty. It's quite good in line in identifying the areas where the activities that has capacity to reduce poverty. However, there are some weaknesses with it, and it's not that good at dealing with vulnerability. When we can observe shifts in poverty in Burkina Faso, we see that the group long-term poor has increased at the same time as the non-poor group, exactly above the poverty threshold, has increased, and this group has become more vulnerable to poverty, whereas those who have decreased are those in the middle. The short-term poor people have decreased. So there has been a shift in two directions here, with increasing vulnerability at the same time. but the SCAD and all, I would say also Swedish aid is not that good at dealing with vulnerability and those issues. I could also say that Swedish aid is not very good at promoting social change. There are parts of it in the SCAD, in that strategy, that you could say is an expression of a will for social change. Sweden is quite active when it comes to democracy support in Burkina Faso, but it's rather, I would say, directed towards formal democracy rather than progressive social change. And to understand this, I think we have to go into definitions of what democracy is and what democracy is used for. So there's quite a lot of work needed to be done in this to understand this properly, I think. I have some thoughts on it because I was more than 10 years ago, I was in charge of a democracy and human rights supports program in Burkina Mali, a Swedish program. So I have some experiences from that, and I've seen how that program has evolved over the years. So it's a big story, but Sweden is also weak on those policies that we could call across-the-board policies for poverty reduction, meaning broad-based education, social protection, and pro-poor growth. Pro-poor growth, yes. This is where Sweden has a strong position, but it's more towards the preconditions for pro-poor growth than growth processes itself. Sweden is not involved in agriculture in Burkina Faso. It's building a lot of dams for keeping water so that you could use during the dry season for cultivating vegetables, for instance, but not sort of raising productivity in the agriculture sector more widely. Up till a couple of years ago, Sweden gave general budget support to Burkina Faso, but that was stopped. Then a decision was taken to stop Swedish aid to Burkina totally. It should be phased out by 2016. Last week, a new Swedish government decided that Sweden shall remain in Burkina Faso, so that decision is now lifted. And there is something more to see on this. And I think in the interest of time, I'll just say that Sweden focuses on tackling extreme poverty, but does less on ending impoverishment and less on staying out of poverty. And I skipped Tanzania because I haven't come that far on that case and moved to a summary. So what I noted is that, as you heard, poverty severity in a country is not what guide the allocations in the Swedish aid programs toward in these countries. Broad education, quality education, social protection are areas that are very thinly supported. Interventions are generally thinly spread in these Swedish programs. There are many 1+s in the table you saw. Sweden is somewhat stronger at tackling extreme poverty and pro-poor growth. And also health, but the tripod is unbalanced. So you could say the glass is half full or half empty, whatever you'd like to interpret it. And I think one should either go for more comprehensive programs or focus on specific areas to do what you're better at, but then you need to coordinate with others. don't you? You need to work with the government, see that here is an area where we can support, where we can put in something extra. And when I read all these documents, I don't find much of that discussion about coordination. So the strategic coordination with other donors, with governments, that is mainly lacking in these documents. It might be that it happens anyway, informally or in unwritten forms, and you sit in meetings, etc. We know that donor coordination is happening that way, but that means that the tool, the strategic tool, is not there to get the information back to headquarters and involve others in this work. I would also say that there's a need to strengthen education and skills training and social protection. So to make this tripod stronger, there is a need for more strategic work, also to see the dynamics of poverty and poverty reduction, to see the combination of interventions that are needed. So glass half full, but there's more to be done.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.